So, good day, panelists. I am Jasper J.A. Orhe, and today we will discuss in the study that we did in regards to the quantitative study about the students' perceptions about open source software with regards to grade 12 STEM students of CITU. So, before we start, I would like you to introduce to my co-researcher first. Mr. CJ Anthony Bohols, Mr. Ali Zernacena, Miss Denise D. Cabanya, Mr. Darnweb Kabahoki, Mr. Troy Homauas, and Miss Laika Perel Fernandez Apostol. And lastly, Mr. Joseph Andre Bregente.
Background of the study. Open source software is software that has the source code available for anyone to examine, edit, and improve. Most computer users never review source code, which is the code that computer programmers can edit to change how a piece of software, a program, or application works. Programmers with access to the computer software source code can improve it by adding new features or addressing portions that don't always perform properly. Open source software, also known as OSS, is a computer software whose underlying source code is made publicly available under a license. Open source first emerged during the 1970s with Richard Stallman from MIT, who popularized the term free software. Richard and others were getting increasingly disgruntled with proprietary software providers, constraints, and the trend toward proprietary software becoming more and more required, also known as closed source. Commercial companies usually restrict access to the source code to protect their intellectual property. The binary is regularly released, while the source code is rarely. Richard's goal was twofold: to encourage more software developers to make their source code open, and to aim to build a fully open source software platform based on the Unix philosophy and design. So let us now talk about the main idea, purpose, and the focal point of our study. Main idea: knowing how open source software affects CITU STEM students in grade 12. Our purpose is to understand how open source software can benefit CITU grade 12 STEM students. And the focus of our study is about determining open source software's usefulness to students.
Statement of the problem. Nowadays, many students are using open source software without knowing what the disadvantages. This study aims to determine the perception of grade 12 students of Cebu Institute of Technology University regarding open source software. Specifically, the researchers aspired to answer these following questions. What is the student's perception on open source software? What are the different kinds of open source software? Lastly, how does open source software affect perceptions? The reason why these three questions are here is because finding out the answer to the questions themselves will help further for our study so that we can learn more about open source software. According to Don Watkins about OSS is that open source software empowers learning. So if students can preserve OSS, it can give them a chance to learn more than what they already have.
For our theoretical background, here is what we would like to happen if our grade 12 STEM students actually use open source software. Number 1, students will be able to master how virtual classes work. Number 2, increasing productivity is one of the benefits of open source software, since most of them are for educational purposes. Number 3, improvement of overall knowledge of the computer. Number 4, since different types of universities have been able to produce courses that are freely accessible to the worldwide education community, where students can easily access for their schoolwork. 5. Will be prepared to use open source software in the future when applying for a job. Lastly, number 6. Makes it simpler for students to collaborate and achieve goals rather than having to do everything on their own. Next one will be our related review of literature. Software by open source. Open source software comes in all shapes and sizes and can serve multiple purposes. Examples include Linux, Apache, Firefox, KOffice, Thunderbird, OpenOffice, Moodle, and Squirrelmail by Lal Wolf 2019. Thus, using software made with open source allows you to be more efficient with your time. Makes browsing through the internet easier and safer with software made by open source. Allows a more stable connection with the web page to prevent it from lagging and disconnecting. Will help you cope in today's world since a lot of devices have access to the internet, which can allow you to have access to open source software.
Also, in addition to that, you should also help developers practice their coding skills by seeing, exploring, and modifying current codes. Because there are software such as AngularJS, Atom, Azure, Bitbucket, Bootstrap, and many other more that programmers can use. And gives programmers the freedom to change or copy specific codes and develop it themselves without any worry about copyrights. Opportunity for coders to expand their knowledge and improve by exploring without cost or low cost. This also provides transparency to students and teachers and would lead a better learning outcomes.
For our research instrument, we'll be using survey questionnaire. In the first page of our survey, we ask our respondents their full name, age, and gender. And for the second page of our survey questionnaire are the questions. The first questions we ask for the respondent is, which of the following do you know and use for your studies? We have given them multiple choices for open source software. The second question is, in a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate the amount of use of the sources you checked in the previous question in the following aspects of education? For this question, the respondents are asked on how much they use the software that they are familiar with. Lastly, for the third question, in a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you perceive the importance of open source in your study nowadays when it comes to? In this one, the respondents are asked on how important open source software is in different academic activities.
Chapter 4. Results and Discussions. This chapter contains detailed presentation and discussion of data analysis and the results of the study. The main determining factor to this response was the perception of the students concerning open source software. Age and sex of the respondents. Respondents through 16 to 20 were allowed to answer the survey. Categories accounting for are mostly at age 18 and 19. The proportion of males to females in this survey were about 9 to 21 in all age groups. This can be attributed to the fact that females are more aware on open source software than males. Familiarity levels of software made by open source. The findings of this study showed that majority of the respondents are not familiar with most of the software options provided. The top 4 most unfamiliar software are Inkscape, Krita, jQuery, and GIMP, while the top 4 most familiar and is still currently in use for our respondents is VLC Media Player, Mozilla Firefox, BitTorrent, and Audacity. Usage grade of the familiarized software. The survey indicates that the majority of the respondents mainly use the selected software for lesson preparation and practice of lessons. Degree of importance in open source software on academic usage. In this study, the perception of students is questioned about whether or not open source software is important for different academic activities. The highest ones are answering of quizzes or exams and answering of assignments. Answering of quizzes/exams is at 22 respondents, and answering of assignments has 18 respondents, meaning they are very important for that specific purpose.
Conclusion. At the present of education, online learning has been slowly adapted to continuously deliver education. The use of internet has been considered to be accompaniment. Open source allows users to freely modify their schoolworks. Students are expected to be familiar with open source to maximize learning. This study shows that a grade of students are just familiar with a few open sources that are Mozilla Firefox and VLC. These are called search engine, a program that searches for and identify items in a database that corresponds to a keywords or characters specified by the user. And students utilize with the search engine in Mozilla Firefox. Moreover, students perceive that they use open source for preparation of lessons and performance tasks. It is most important for their lesson preparation, assignments, and answering exams or quiz.
Our recommendations are: it is recommended that the next researcher will conduct live interviews to selected respondents to have more in-depth discussion on their perspective. The second one is, it is also recommended to have a seminar about open source softwares to students and the different applications. The third recommendation is, it is also recommended to conduct this research to other schools with grade 12 students. Another recommendation is to test the efficiency and reliability of open source software, not just to grade 12 students, but also to elementary and junior high schools.